For over 5 decades, the Assad family ruled Syria with an iron fist. Under Bashar al-Assad, that grip turned into a stranglehold, plunging the nation into a nightmare of war, destruction, and terror. Decades of repression and brutality defined their rule. But on December 8, 2024, the unthinkable happened. Assad's regime crumbled in a matter of days, marking the end of a brutal dynasty and the beginning of an uncertain chapter for Syria. The story begins in 1970, when Hafez al-Assad seized power in a bloodless coup. Over the next 30 years, Hafez turned Syria into a police state. His intelligence services, the Mukhabarat, operated like a shadow government, torturing and executing anyone who dared to dissent. Political opponents disappeared, and fear became the Assad family's most powerful weapon. For the Syrian people, freedom was a distant memory. Conversations were whispered in private, and even a hint of criticism could lead to imprisonment or worse. Hafez's rule was marked by crackdowns so severe they became etched into history, like the infamous Hama massacre of 1982, where tens of thousands were killed. Hafez had grand plans for his eldest son, Basil, to inherit the presidency. Basil was charismatic, disciplined, and prepared for power. But in 1994, a car crash changed everything. Basil's death thrust his younger brother Bashar into the spotlight. A man who had spent his life far from Syria's corridors of power was now being shaped into a leader. Bashar al-Assad was no tyrant in the making. As a young man, he seemed content with a quiet life, studying medicine in London and specializing in ophthalmology. But after Basil's death, Bashar was summoned back to Damascus. Hafez began grooming him, preparing him for a role he never wanted. When Hafez died in 2000, Bashar, just 34 years old, became Syria's new president. The world watched with cautious optimism. Many believed Bashar's Western education and calm demeanor would bring much-needed reforms to Syria. But the quiet doctor who stepped into his father's shoes would soon transform into a ruler even more brutal than his predecessor. Bashar's rise to power inspired hope among Syrians and the international community. Early in his presidency, he introduced minor reforms, including limited economic liberalization and the introduction of the Internet. These changes fueled a period of optimism known as the Damascus Spring, where activists and intellectuals called for greater freedoms. But Bashar's promises of reform were short-lived. Within a year, he crushed the Damascus Spring, arresting activists and silencing dissent. The Mukhabarat, his father's infamous secret police, grew even more powerful under Bashar's rule. Any hope for a freer Syria quickly faded, replaced by an atmosphere of fear and repression. In 2011, the Arab Spring ignited protests across the Middle East. In Syria, thousands of people took to the streets, demanding dignity, freedom, and an end to decades of dictatorship. Bashar al-Assad responded with brutal force. Security forces opened fire on demonstrators, arrested activists, and tortured anyone suspected of opposing the regime. The protests escalated into a full-blown civil war. Assad's forces used every weapon at their disposal, from barrel bombs to chemical attacks. Entire neighborhoods were flattened, and cities like Aleppo and Homs were turned into graveyards. Refugees poured across borders, fleeing the relentless violence, while millions remained trapped in a living nightmare. Prisons became slaughterhouses, with detainees enduring unimaginable torture. Saydnaya prison, known as the Slaughterhouse, became infamous for mass executions and horrific abuses. Assad's war against his own people plunged Syria into chaos, leaving scars that will take generations to heal. Facing mounting pressure from rebel forces, Assad turned to his allies for support. Iran sent weapons and militias, including fighters from Hezbollah. Russia launched a military intervention in 2015, unleashing airstrikes that devastated rebel-held areas. The combined efforts of Russia and Iran allowed Assad to reclaim key territories, including Aleppo in 2016. But this support came at a cost. Syria became a battleground for foreign powers, with its future increasingly dictated by Moscow and Tehran. Assad's reliance on foreign allies underscored his inability to maintain control on his own. He remained in power, but his regime grew weaker with every passing year. The collapse of the Assad regime was swift and unexpected. On November 30th, 2024, a coalition of rebel forces led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham launched a lightning-fast offensive. The campaign began with the capture of Aleppo, Syria's largest city. From there, the rebels advanced south, seizing Hama and Homs with little resistance. By December 7, the rebels had encircled Damascus. On December 8th, they stormed the capital, liberating thousands of prisoners and ransacking Assad's opulent palace. Footage revealed vast car collections, gilded interiors, and other symbols of a regime that lived in luxury, while its people suffered. As the rebels declared Damascus liberated, Assad fled to Moscow, abandoning the country he had ruled with an iron grip. After taking Damascus, the rebels uncovered the full extent of Assad's brutality. In Saydnaya prison, they found mass graves and torture chambers that bore witness to years of systematic abuse. Survivors were freed, many of them skeletal and broken from years of starvation and torture. Families of the dead were invited to identify their loved ones, bringing closure to some but unearthing fresh grief for others. Saydnaya, known as the Slaughterhouse, became a symbol of the Assad regime's cruelty. The rebels vowed to document these crimes and hold those responsible accountable. The horrors uncovered in the wake of Assad's downfall reminded the world of the price Syrians paid for freedom. With Assad gone, the rebels have begun forming a new government. Led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, they promise a future built on institutions and democracy. But questions remain about their ability to govern and whether they can overcome the divisions that have plagued Syria for decades. As Syrians begin returning to their homes and rebuilding their lives, hope is mixed with uncertainty. The scars of war and tyranny run deep, and the road to peace will be long and fraught with challenges. The fall of Bashar al-Assad signals the close of a dark chapter marked by fear, oppression, and unimaginable suffering. Yet, Syria's story is far from complete. Its people, wounded but unbroken, now face the immense challenge of rebuilding a nation that pays tribute to those who endured and sacrificed. They must strive to create a future rooted in hope and resilience. The eyes of the world remain fixed on Syria, watching as it takes its first steps toward a new beginning.